can we start with suffering? How does Christianity help us understand suffering?
Well, okay, so trauma, if we talk about trauma, and all of us are going to experience, that's the one universal in all of our human experience. I don't care where we come from in terms of ethnicity or how we were raised or any of the things we might experience in life, but none of us probably are going to get out without experiencing some suffering, some trauma. Now, the level of trauma will be different for different people, and sometimes it's really, really significant, and sometimes it's not that significant, but we're the kind of people who take it so sensitively, it feels significant. I'm not here to argue any of that. Here I am here to say, we need to help ourselves think about what trauma is. Well, it's really interesting if you drill down, because trauma is simply when the view of you hold of the world is shattered by something. You have this expectation, you have a way you think the world ought to work, and then something happens in life that shatters your expectation or shatters the view you had of the world. Maybe if you're a Christian, for example, and you thought that Christians should never experience X, devout Christians who love God, who are trying to do the right thing, should never suffer. You're having a Job experience. Okay, what's happening is your view of Christianity maybe needs to be changed, because what's happening is you have a view of the world and it's being challenged by an experience you're having. This is what defines trauma, and it's different for everybody. So it turns out that we do a lot of trauma counseling with police officers who have been critically injured, and they are come to us through a Billy Graham Association, and we spend time doing marriage resiliency with these folks because their marriages are struggling because they've suffered. Now, it's a lot goes into it, but I'll tell you this. If you stay on the other side of the trauma and you can't get off your knees, if it knocks you to your knees and you don't seem like you can even function, and you're experiencing now physical symptoms, but typically we'll get to diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm still disabled. I cannot rise back to the level of functioning I was at prior to the trauma. If you do get back to that level of functioning, we call that resiliency. But for all the officers who come up to do this marriage resiliency, my hope is for post-traumatic growth, not resiliency. In other words, is it possible on the backside of trauma that you could actually perform at a higher level than you were prior to the trauma? That actually something about the trauma itself initiates a new chapter in life in which you are now performing at a higher level. Now, the secular folks who study this, and they've been doing it since the 90s, and I've collected all that data, they will call this approach to counseling, this approach to helping people who have suffered trauma, the people who do the best are people who what they call meaning making, the endeavor of meaning making. In other words, if you can figure out how it is in your life, maybe your view of life was wrong, and once you adjust it slightly so you can make sense of the overarching narrative of your life, so that now this trauma fits within the new construct you have for the world in which you live, you will do a better job of coming out the backside and flourishing.
But
now,
this is, of course, in the book you describe, it's not, we're not making our own meaning.
That's why I think you need to change the title. Yeah, because, and by the way, that was something that I went back and forth with Amy Hall, who's always my editor on my books, and Amy's a brilliant mind. And she says, we're not really meaning making, we're meaning finding as Christians. And you're right, we are. And that's why we've changed this to meaning finding when we talk about it, because we would say, hey, not any version of reality you can make up is going to necessarily make sense of your suffering. Now, it might for a season, but then the next time you suffer in some new way, you bump into a new need for making meaning. What if there was an overarching meaning to life? And you could figure out if your event, your traumatic event, was the final chapter in your story or just the climactic chapter in the story from which the story is going to resolve in a beautiful way. What if there's a story that's already out there that you're just part of? You're not making up your own story. You're actually fitting into a story that already exists. If that's the case, well, now you can finally figure out. Let's look at it this way. And you see this if you're a Christian and you know the Bible at all. You see this in terms of if you stopped Job in chapter 2, that's a tragedy. If you stop the story of Jesus at the cross, that's a tragedy. If you stop even something simple, and I've been using this example because I think it's so simple. John Mark, when Paul says, you're not coming with us, And so his story could have ended. That could have been the final chapter. But he goes on, John Mark goes on to be one of the best associates of both Peter and Paul.
Yeah.
They include him in his letters. And then he ends up writing a gospel sitting at the feet of Peter that becomes the gospel of Mark. And now this knucklehead who's a nobody, who almost had a final chapter of You're Not Coming, his ends up being on that board of 4 with the 4 gospel authors. You see these very majestic pictures of John and Matthew and Luke, and who else? Mark, a dude whose story could have ended in the book of Acts.
Right downtown, there's St. Mark's Church.
Yes, there you go. You're right. So this is why we have to figure out, like, how do we find meaning? And meaning finding, and I talk about this in the book, how we do that. But the point is, meaning finding is available to us under a theistic worldview like Christianity that offers. I think what happens too is that we often think, well, God's not the author of evil, and suffering is evil. So this cannot be the will of God for anyone that they should suffer. Well, really? Have we mistakenly seen suffering as evil? In other words, we attribute nothing good can come of suffering. Or does almost everything good come of suffering? Because if the latter is true, you're not going to develop the character in your own children of courage without danger, of compassion without trauma, without suffering, of charity without poverty, of whatever it is you think is good that you want in the life of your kids. It's not a switch you just flip. It's a response to a negative experience. All character. You don't pray for patience. You pray for patience, you're going to get kids who are going to test your patience.
Yeah, that's right.
So it turns out that everything that you would hope to become is typically the result of some traumatic experience or something that is a piece of sandpaper on the wood.
When someone's going through trauma, like the stories that you write about in your book, how do they go from stress, post-traumatic stress, to resiliency, and then how do they take that last step towards growth? What is the secret to that?
Well, and I can tell you the secret is in rethinking your worldview, because what's causing the trauma is that you had a certain expectation of the world that was not met, and was worse than that, it was destroyed and obliterated.
Yeah.
And so the story I have in the book is a story of a family that suffered the loss of their daughter, and the sister really did not begin to live until we reopened the case. And a lot of it was because we started having deeper conversations about her Christian worldview, right? Because her Christian worldview could not account for the suffering. Their Christian worldview could not account for this trauma. There was no way to see and go on. And her sister, who passed away, who died in the murder, was a very devout Christian. I mean, of all the whole family, she was the reason why this surviving sister was a Christian. And she always looked to her as like the epitome of what it would be to be a Christian. And then God lets this happen to her. And she was one of those victims who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had just working in a restaurant, should not have been there. She was taking somebody else's shift, and she ends up the one who's dead. So it was, I think, so part of it was that I spent a lot of time with this one particular sister talking, because she was a Christian. And not always will you even talk about your faith in the context of your work as a detective. I'm very respectful of where people are starting from. But she was the one who found out that I was a part-time youth pastor. So she knew she had a source to talk to about this. And that opened the door to deep conversations that helped her to rethink the narrative structure of her life. And the narrative structure then became God's story, not her story. And it wasn't about trying to make up some new story. It was about finding her place in all of the chapters of God's story. And that changed the way she saw this. And then as a result, she allowed this. And almost always when we suffer, we gain a skill set that we can then use to help others who are suffering. And that's exactly what she did.
2 Corinthians chapter 1.
Right.
God comforts us, then we comfort others.
That's right.
Love it.